Well, good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This is our study for Friday, June 14th, 2024. And not a lot going on here this week. Uh, didn't have to do with lawn this week, so there just wasn't a whole lot going on. What we did run into was that my wife's son got something started on social media.
Maybe we shouldn't bring that up. I don't want him shot.
Yeah. We're not going to say what he said. We're just going to note that he posted some political zingers, is what he did. And my wife advised him that maybe he needs to get himself a bulletproof vest. Uh, because, as I think most of you are aware, the political environment in this country has become rather toxic and highly divisive. You may have noticed that while we may not succeed all the time, we do try to avoid discussing politics in our Friday night Bible study. We firmly believe in the separation of church and state. We further believe that the government is not going to save us. And we don't mean that just in the sense of the government won't get us to the promised land, but we actually mean that the government can't really do a whole lot to fix the problems of everyday life. It's not going to save us that way either. There was a lot of talk a few years back about who to blame for the inflation that took place. Well, the obvious explanation for the inflation was that we had a pandemic, and the pandemic was causing businesses to close because of the social distancing provisions that were put in place, and the closing of venues where people tended to gather together in large numbers in a hope to prevent the spread of the disease. And that caused people to lose their jobs in some cases. Businesses went out of business. And in order to ease the impact of that, the government issued some assistance to people trying to stimulate the economy. So now you've got a two-pronged problem for our system of commerce. Namely, you have a big supply of money because of the stimulus funds that were being paid out by the government. And on top of that, you have a restriction on the supply of goods because produce the institutions that produce the goods are in some cases closing down or reducing production because they don't have the workers for it, and so on and so forth. So when you have lots of money available and you don't have a lot of product available, guess what? You have inflation. The price of the product goes up. Supply and demand type of situation going on there, which is one of the reasons, our system of commerce is founded on the competitive structures that were brought to this planet when Adam and Eve believed the lies of the enemy and plunged this world into the darkness and mess that we call sin. And so, you can't really blame the government other than that the government provided all that stimulus money trying to protect the economy from an even further uh, problems if even more businesses were to go bankrupt and go out of business. And both political parties engaged in providing that economic stimulus. So you really can't say that's a political issue, and you can't blame one politician or another. They were all involved. So we try to avoid politics, and one of the reasons for that is because it can be so divisive. We're human beings, and as human beings, we tend to be pretty enamored of our own opinions. In other words, we think we're right, and that people who have different ideas than us are therefore wrong. And so then we start engaging in personal attacks and bitter debate. We have in this group identified three aspects of our lives that are outside of God's plan for our living. And those three areas are government. And we have pointed out that while, and some people might take that to be a sovereign citizens type of statement, God owns the land, so nobody else gets to own it and charges for it. God, our allegiance belongs to God, therefore it doesn't belong to the government and to the courts. So the courts have no jurisdiction and authority over us, and they come with all sorts of wild interpretations of the Constitution to say that. We don't hold to that because we believe that God calls on us, while we recognize that government is not the way God would go about things, that God allows this because we're steeped in sin, and the processes and restrictions of government, while they don't recognize our liberties as provided by God, are necessary to keep the whole issue of human madness and insanity and viciousness toward each other in check. These things help. And the same thing then with the second institution, that's the institution of commerce. That was invented by the ancient Babylonians. So when the Bible talks negatively about Babylon, it is possible to interpret that it is talking about this system of commerce and all the problems that it creates. I watched a court case just yesterday. A family, two sisters, at each other's throats in a sense, because when mother died, she left the house, and neither of the sisters had the money to buy the house. So all they can hope is to get the equity of the house out of the house and split that. So the sister who became executor of mother's estate ended up going to court to get the other sister kicked out of the house, evicted. After she was evicted, apparently the sale didn't go through right away, and this sister and her boyfriend moved back in. And so it ended up going to court again. So this whole issue of commerce and money can make for very bitter relationships between people. And of course, then the third area, which also makes for a lot of conflict in the human realm, is that of religion. Religion, as normally practiced by humans, doesn't really lead us to God. It's usually about restricting our liberties, about taking our money, our commerce, in order to make itself operational, and about staking out positions on the interpretation of the Bible that then become, in their minds, truth, and we end up fighting for the truth and opposing heretics, and in some cases killing heretics. None of this is godly. And if you look at, and this was something we heard recently, we heard a preacher actually saying that the Jews didn't kill Jesus, that was the Roman government. Well, it wasn't Jews in general that killed Jesus, it was the Jewish religious leaders who coerced the Roman government into executing Jesus for them. And we've talked about what's going on there in the past. And the man who betrayed Jesus to the authorities received money for what he did. So, in the death of Jesus, we see all three of those human institutions involved: government, commerce, and religion. All of them had a part to play in executing Jesus Christ. Now, for all three of those, we maintain the same approach as individuals, and that is that out of love, we recognize, respect, and obey the authorities that these institutions place over us. We pay for the things we use in commerce. We obey the government and respect its system of justice. And we respect the right of religion to operate as it does, even though we understand that these things are not ultimately godly. We, out of love, treat them with respect and don't make nuts of ourselves out there demonstrating against them and opposing them and saying, well, you don't have any authority over me, and my allegiance is to God, that kind of blah blah nonsense. So I thought I'd talk about that. Go ahead, say something.
About the mask issue, we don't believe that when masks were mandated,
Mm-hmm.
for wearing a mask, not we weren't worried about our rights to choose whether or not to wear a mask. Yeah, we do have the right to choose, but our right to choose to not wear a mask ends when it comes to risking somebody else's life.
Right.
We don't have the right to take somebody else's life by spreading the germ.
A
And the
potentially
reason we
fatal
don't have
disease.
that right is because it's not an act of love to put somebody else's life in danger.
Yeah. And
So we give up our right to choose to not wear a mask as an act of love to our neighbor.
right. And what I think my wife brings that up because we know of a religious teacher who, when the pandemic came around, made a big deal about asserting his right not to have to wear a mask, and actually went out and kind of made a pariah of himself in the local community, not our local community, but his local community, by refusing to wear a mask when it was required, and acting like that was his God-given right, blah blah blah. Well, it may be your God-given right, but God calls you to live by the principle of unselfish, disinterested, and um, unconditional love. And that is how God takes care of government and commerce and religion, all those things. What was Jesus' simple rule? Two rules: love God with everything you've got, love your neighbor as yourself. Those two simple principles, lived out, made part of the character, and thereby healing the broken character, would do away with all the conflict and strife in our human sphere. And we wouldn't need religion, we wouldn't need commerce, we wouldn't need government, because love would be the governing, guiding force. And we would live the way God intended us, in control of ourselves, rather than reaching out and trying to control one another, because due to the brokenness of sin, we're unable to control ourselves. So, kind of got off on a little hobby horse there, but we wanted to make a point that, you know, which political party takes office can have some small impact on our everyday lives. And of course, it was political back last century, when a certain country decided to try and take over the world and force their toxic approach to living on everybody, and attempted to engage in genocide against a certain race. But that's just a way to demonstrate the toxicity of politics, of commerce, and of religion, because religion was involved in those things. And of course, the government very often gets involved in controlling commerce. That's generally one of the roles we see that's important for government. If somebody takes something without paying for it, that's called retail fraud usually, and we arrest that person, excuse me, take them to court and punish them for what they've done. That is in support of commerce. And again, we make the point. What we believe is that if we operate on the basis of love, then as long as we are in this world, we will respect and honor the system of commerce, even as we understand that that's not God's way of doing things. So,
And the church is not above the law of theft.
no, it isn't. But there's a lot of things that our system of commerce allows that are in reality theft, as God would view things. And you're talking about religion does that, government does that, commerce, those things do engage in theft. And it's allowed because in our written rule approach to living, these things are, quotes, legal. That's why we say that God's law is not written rules, because written rules are limited, and written rules end up encoding and institutionalizing some of the abuses that have become just part of everyday life in our broken human society. Anyway, I think we would like to. Do you need me to come in there and restart that?
I kicked it off, but I wish I hadn't.
Okay, let me pause this real quick and I'll go in there and get that reset. Then I'll come back and we'll keep going. So we got that taken care of. My wife has problems with her legs. She has lymphedema, and sometimes they hurt. And she's found that if she uses a massager on the side of her leg, it helps to relieve some of the pain that she feels there. And she
I
had,
have both lymphedema and venous insufficiency in that leg,
right,
and uh, sometimes the pain is just unbearable. And I've got a massager that I can put on the leg, and it will solve the problem that even a painkiller won't
yeah.
touch.
And unfortunately, it's not a massager that's designed for that part of the body. It's designed to go around the neck, and you put your arms through it and hold it against your neck, and it massages your neck and the shoulders.
And
So,
if I
it,
don't take care of the leg, it will turn into cellulitis, which
right,
could put me in the hospital, and it does kill people. So
yeah,
I have to take care of that leg. And because of that, the swelling is just getting worse and worse, and I'm just getting bigger and bigger, and they tell me there's nothing that can be done about it, and I have to keep my legs elevated. Most of the time, if I don't elevate my legs, then I develop this pain in my leg, which has weakened me to the point that I can no longer get up and get around. I've become bedfast essentially, and the swelling in the legs are so bad that I can no longer lay in a bed.
yeah,
I
and
can't get my feet together. I can't get my feet together. I walk using a walker, and my legs are shaped in a V. It's ridiculous. I'm in a recliner 24/7.
and then her daughter-in-law calls and says, "Well, there is something you can do. You can get this surgery and that treatment, and blah blah blah."
But it's not available for me.
So anyway, I think we'd like to go ahead and get started. We've been well. Last week we crossed over from the book of Genesis into the book of Exodus. We'll talk about that again once we get started. So let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings to us, and we thank you that we have the written word, and that it is something that we can come together and examine, read, and try to understand. In our attempt to understand, we want your assistance in drawing out what you would like us to understand from it. So we ask that the Holy Spirit will be close to each person who hears and watches this little study, and gives them the support and understanding that that person needs. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we, as we said, are in the book of Exodus. And last week we started the story of Moses. We read about the Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. And this version put it, he didn't know about Joseph. Well, we think he knew about Joseph, but he didn't know Joseph and his approach to governing. And he didn't know how much damage he could do to himself and his country if he oppressed the Israelites. Now, how long were they oppressed like that? Hard to say. It seems, and the biblical narrative isn't conclusive on this, but it does seem that the same Pharaoh began the oppression of the Jews and was the one who suffered great loss when God set about to set his people free. But maybe not. The Bible isn't clear. Secular historians have tried to identify which Pharaoh was the Pharaoh of the book of Exodus. And maybe it was more than one, because maybe it was one Pharaoh who put the Hebrews under subjugation, and then a later Pharaoh who maintained it, and is the one, as we will read later, who hardened his heart, essentially refusing to release the slaves. And any political leader in a situation like that, where you have free labor, which benefits commerce, is going to find it very hard to set these people free because of the economic impact and because the people around him who support him and who give him his political power won't hear of it. So while the Bible reads that Pharaoh hardened his heart, it certainly, we think, probably wasn't entirely a personal and individual decision. It was a national decision, and there was an element where Pharaoh didn't have the, we sometimes call it intestinal fortitude or guts, to stand up against his country and his people and say, this is the right thing to do. I'm going to make that decision and impose it on everybody else anyway. And we'll probably run into that as we get to that part of the story. But we read how the oppression of the Israelites, of the Hebrews, got so intense that at least one of the pharaohs involved ordered that all Hebrew male children be killed. And his means of execution was to throw them into the Nile River. And so one of the Hebrew mothers put her son in a basket and then put that basket in the river, just like the king had said. And of course, we know that's Moses. The princess found him and adopted him as her own child. And so he grew up, and we read the story of all that happens. And he got in trouble. He had to flee. And according to the narrative, he spent about 40 years in Egypt.
Yes, he put my foot to sleep.
You want me to take it off?
Yeah, please.
Okay, we're going to pause this a moment and I'll come back after I've done that. So, once Moses had committed murder and then found out that everybody knew about it and that Pharaoh wanted his head, essentially, he fled to Midian, which we suggested last week may have been somewhere in what we today would call Saudi Arabia. And there he attached himself to the priest of Midian. And here he's going to be called Jethro. Earlier in the book, Reuel, yeah. And in fact, I think we can see here, if you're reading there in the text that we've got up on screen here, you can see that they've got a footnote there for Jethro. And if we go down to the bottom, it says, Moses' father-in-law went by two names, Jethro and Reuel. Well, I'm going to say maybe so, maybe not. There is a different name given for him, but then they're not saying that the Hebrew says something different, so maybe both names were given. So that could be true. We know later in the book of Exodus, or in one of the other books, he visits his son-in-law, and I think he's called Jethro there. The priest of Midian. So let's go ahead and start reading here in chapter 3, verse 1. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, or Reuel, whichever it was. The point is, it's the priest of Midian, and it's his father-in-law, because he married this man's daughter Zipporah, had 2 sons by her, at least. 2 we're told about, may have been more. And so he's spent here, and the narrative suggests that these events are almost 40 years into his sojourn in the land of Midian. So he spent about half of his life living in Egypt and half of his life living in Midian. And by that time, Egypt is kind of a distant memory for him, no doubt. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. Now that's also footnoted, footnote B. Hebrew is Horeb, and they say, well, that's another name for Sinai. Well, we're not so sure. Notice that we suggested, and I don't think we can be certain about this, we suggested that the land of Midian was somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and we've also suggested that we know today that what we call the Sinai Peninsula is part of the territory of Egypt. And if it was so back in that day, and it might have been, it would not have been safe for Moses to be in the Sinai Peninsula under the control of Egypt. He had to get farther away. So the Bible speaks of Horeb, the mountain of God. It speaks when we get to the story of Elijah traveling on foot 40 days to get to Horeb, the mountain of God. If you measure the distance from Israel to what's called Mount Sinai nowadays, I don't think it would take 40 days unless you were pretty decrepit. And I don't think Elijah was particularly decrepit, since he ran just a few days earlier, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot down the mountain. No, he wasn't decrepit. So it suggests to me, anyway, that he went a little bit farther than just someplace in the Sinai Peninsula. So, and people have suggested that there are mountains in Saudi Arabia that meet the definition and that have larger plains around them where the people might have encamped. And in fact, this theory even goes so far as to suggest that when the people crossed the Reed Sea, which we generally interpret to be the Red Sea, that it was not the western arm of the Red Sea that they crossed, but the eastern arm of the Red Sea. And maybe when we get to that part of the story, we'll get into Google Earth and we'll look at some places that might meet the descriptions given in the book of Exodus about those events. But at any rate, what we're talking about now is where Moses is. He's at the mountain of God, and apparently it was already known as such, although we have seen where occasionally the Old Testament uses a name for a place that it didn't have until later. And certainly Sinai would have become, or Horeb, would have become known as the mountain of God once all the experiences of the Hebrew people at that mountain took place. But it's also perhaps known as the mountain of God at this time, and was one of the reasons why what we're about to read took place. So we get into verse 2, and it says, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush." Now, we have suggested in the past that when the Old Testament speaks of the angel of the Lord, that it's actually speaking of Jesus Christ, a member of the Godhead, depending on what you believe, and that he appeared there to Moses in a blazing fire. Our God is a fire, the Bible suggests. But here's what's interesting. It says Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. Well, our God is a, quotes, consuming fire. What does it consume? Well, it's not a combusting fire, it's a consuming fire because it consumes sin. It's pure, it is of a good character, it is not destructive. The fire that we're familiar with is destructive. Your house catches fire, it burns down, you lose your house. You lose the money you had invested in your house. You lose your place to live. Fire can be extremely destructive, as we understand it. But this bush was engulfed in flames, or it looked like it, because the presence of the angel of the Lord was there in the bush. And that fire was not a combusting fire, it wasn't a destructive fire. So even though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. Now, I have encountered some secular television programs which try to explain this story away by identifying a bush that is native to that area that sometimes catches fire until its flammable sap is burned up, but that the bush itself survives this flame. So they're trying to give a perfectly natural explanation for this without admitting the existence of a divine presence in this world. I don't necessarily buy that. The
And
bush,
we explore the term messenger of God.
right?
The messenger, excuse me, I believe the Bible identifies a messenger. An angel is a messenger, so it would be the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is a messenger.
And the Lord here is all caps, so it's the messenger of Yahweh.
What was Jesus' purpose when he came to live among humans?
To reveal to us the character of God.
Like to live within the realms of God's design.
Right? And as some people have put it, to demonstrate, because he did it in human flesh, to demonstrate that it was possible to live a pure, sinless human life in human flesh. Or as somebody that we used to listen to put it, there was no manufacturer's defect. The defect came around afterward. It wasn't inherent in the construction of the human animal. But what the point we're making here is that the reason the bush didn't burn up was because the fire that engulfed it was not a destructive combusting fire, but actually the fire of God's presence.
A healing fire.
Mm-hmm. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush. Well, now it was at first the angel of the Lord. Now the Lord himself, Yahweh himself, is there talking to Moses from the bush. Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. Now, a lot of people like to take this and suggest and to instill close to fear in people's hearts by telling you that such a thing is holy ground, and if you violate it, God's going to zap you and you're going to die, and so on and so forth, we're going to suggest that God is warning Moses because his presence is a consuming fire and it consumes sin. And all of us humans are broken and spiritually and emotionally sick because of the sin condition we were born into. We need healing, we need help. But it would be wrong, it would be impossible for us to enter directly into the divine presence because the divine presence consumes sin and brokenness, and we wouldn't be safe there. So the Lord, Yahweh, warns Moses as he comes up to look at this bush not to come any closer so that he, a sinful human, is not destroyed by God's pure, holy presence. Now, the bit about taking off his sandals, that's probably attaching to human cultural standards, and God is simply giving Moses reason to understand that he's dealing with something very powerful. And the way you recognize that was to take off your shoes or your sandals.
That's how they sold. Um, that's how they sealed the contract. They removed their shoe.
Right.
I'm not sure how that did.
I am the God of your father, and there's a footnote there on that. Footnote C, Greek version reads, your fathers. All right. Well, okay. We usually take the Greek version with a bit of a grain of salt, but I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now, that is a natural human reaction. We see things that are great, that have great power, fire, electricity, and so forth, and we sometimes approach them with fear because we know the damage they can do if misapplied. And so, while Moses shouldn't have had reason to fear, he did because he was human and he recognized the power of God, and it made him afraid. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. That's how how chapter 2 ended. God heard the outcry of his people and began to move to take action about what was going on earth. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Well, this has been going on for how many years now? We don't know for sure, but at least 40 if the chronology that we get later is to be believed. Well, more than 40 years, more than 80 years, because the Israelites were already under oppression at the time Moses was born. So it's been probably at least 100 years, maybe more, since the people were enslaved, and they still are enslaved. Then the Lord told him, I've certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. Their own fertile and spacious land, is a land flowing with milk and honey. The land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Now let me count that. Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. He just named 6. In other cases, we're going to run into 7 nationalities or 7 people groups living in that territory. Going on, God says, look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. Imagine yourself in Moses' shoes at this point. He's a pariah in Egypt. Egypt wants Moses dead. I'm thinking of that song we sang when I was in the glee club in college. How'd it go? Moses, way back there in the wilderness, saw some smoke, came to the bush, and the bush was burning. God said, take off your shoes, Moses. You're on holy ground. Moses, I'm calling you to work for me. Moses, I'm calling you to set my people free. Not me, Lord. One of our Glee Club members was a soloist on that, and we actually had a female soloist as well, who joined us in some of our concert performances of the piece. I don't think we did it when touring, because usually the female soloist wasn't with us when we toured, but we did do some performances of that. And it goes into all the interaction that we're about to read here between God and Moses, and how it closes with the idea of what do you have in your hand, because Moses had the rod. We're going to see that. If God is calling you, you need to give up what you have in your hand to answer God's call. Give it up, throw it down, and so on. So, Moses has been out of Egypt for 40 years. Now God says, I've picked you. You go lead my people out of Egypt. Well, 40 years earlier, I think Moses thought, yeah, I'm the guy for this. I've been educated by the Egyptians. I've got the leadership qualities. I've got the skills. I've got the knowledge. I've got all these things. I'm just the right guy to see to it that my people are freed from the oppression of the Egyptians. And he went about trying to do that by the typical human means, and essentially fell flat on his face. Well, now he's been tending sheep for roughly 40 years. And what does he say? But Moses protested to God, who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? Not me, Lord. You got the wrong man. I can't do it. Which some people have pointed out, and I think perhaps accurately, when you admit that you can't do it, you are finally qualified to work for God. When you recognize your own human limitations, your own brokenness, the mess you've made of things, and how bad you are at things, then God is able to use you. So Moses said, you got the wrong guy, God. I can't appear before Pharaoh. He tried to kill me. He probably still wants to kill me if he sees me. And I recognize now I don't have the skills to lead people. You want me to lead them out of Egypt? God answered, I will be with you. And this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain. But Moses protested. But if I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? He's bringing up objections. Your Honor, I object. What's your objection this time? First objection was, well, I'm not the right one. Well, okay, if I go, what am I going to tell the Israelites? Who am I going to tell them sent me? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And you notice they put that I am in all caps, as they did the I am who I am. Footnote D. I will be what I will be. And then for the I am, the Hebrew is Yahweh. It's a transliteration of the proper name YHWH, what we call the Tetragrammaton, because it's 4 Hebrew consonants, that is sometimes rendered Jehovah. In this translation, it is usually rendered the Lord. Note the use of small capitals. In other words, all capital letters instead of upper and lowercase letters for the word Lord. And that's how we know that they're translating the Tetragrammaton. We've been over that before, but at this point they bring it up in the footnote there. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my eternal name, my name to remember for all generations. And when we get to that point and it talks about name in the Bible, what does name represent?
Character.
Character. This is my eternal character, my character to remember for all generations. I am who I am. Any other representation of me, any other idea about my character is wrong. I am who I am. That is my name, my character. I'm identified by my character. And you need to remember that. Now go and call together all the elders of Israel. Tell them, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me. He told me, I have been watching closely, and I see how the Egyptians are treating you. Well, that's been true all along, but now God sees that his people are ready, at least some of them, to accept his help. And he is prepared now in his own time, in his own way, to deal with this problem. I see how the Egyptians are treating you. I have promised to rescue you from the oppression in Egypt. I will lead you to a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. That's the same 6 people groups as mentioned just a moment earlier. The elders of Israel will accept your message. Then you and the elders must go to the king of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So please let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. We might wonder here. We know what God's intent was. God's intent was to set his people free and remove them from Egypt. So why is he instructing his agents to request a 3-day reprieve and a 3-day journey? Well, I don't know. We'll let you think about that. Maybe we'll offer some theories in the future.
Maybe God didn't request it. Maybe Moses was uncomfortable with let us go and put that stipulation.
Well, yeah, the narrative here is quoting God as saying 3-day journey into the wilderness. But who knows?
And who wrote it?
Yeah. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand forces him. Footnote F. As in Greek and Latin versions, the Hebrew reads, will not let you go, not by a mighty hand. Well, I don't know. I kind of like the Hebrew there.
The whole thing, because it makes God out to be acting deceptively.
Yeah. And also the Greek and Latin versions, based as they were on people who are a little bit out of touch with the character of God, put this in here that the mighty hand forces him, rather than even if a mighty hand forced him, he won't let them go. Suggests that God is not threatening to be the mighty hand that forces Egypt. He's just saying that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, isn't going to agree to this. And that's not an act of intense prophetic power. It wouldn't take a great prognosticator to look at the situation in Egypt at that time and predict that Pharaoh would not agree to set the people of Israel free. That was kind of a given, an obvious thing. But then God says, then at last he will let you go, and I will cause the Egyptians to look favorably on you. They will give you gifts when you go, so you will not leave empty-handed. Every Israelite woman will ask for articles of silver and gold and fine clothing from her Egyptian neighbors and from the foreign women in their houses. You will dress your sons and daughters with these, stripping the Egyptians of their wealth. Or, as the NIV puts it, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Now, some people have pointed out that what God's doing here isn't stealing, that in fact, through their labor, the Israelites had earned all this wealth, and so God acts for them to receive what they had already earned, suggesting that God does not respect human laws and our ideas of legality. Legally, in Egypt, according to the laws of Egypt, this money was not due and owing to the Hebrew. But in God's eyes, it was. Can we do another chapter? I see we've been going for about an hour already. Maybe we need to slow down on our comment and just read. The confrontation between Moses and God continues in this chapter, but Moses protested again. Now, God's already told him, You go to the elders of Israel, you tell them what I told them to tell you, and they'll listen to you. But now Moses says, well, what if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, the Lord never appeared to you? In other words, he's not believing what God just told him. God says they'll listen to you. Moses said, well, I don't think they will. What if they don't? What if they say, you're just telling us tales? The Lord never really appeared to you. You just made this all up. It's all in your head. You're a crackpot and goofy. Then the Lord asked him, what is that in your hand? Or as the song put, what do you have in your hand, Moses? It's just a rod. A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. Throw it down on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Well, in the song, there's a lot of back and forth about that. The soloist sings, Lord, don't take my rod away from me. Lord, you know it's my only security. Don't you know when you've lived here all alone, a man needs something he can call his own, not me, Lord. And then, as originally written, it was changed. The version that we sang was altered a bit. Once Moses throws down the snake, the piano changes and goes into a very up-tempo approach to the music. And the words are, Moses started running. And the way we sang it was running from a hissing snake, because when Moses threw the rod down, the rod became a hissing snake. In the original version of the song, the authors put it, Moses started running from a hot rod.
A hot rod?
A
No.
hot
A
rod.
hot what?
R-O-D, hot rod. You know,
Well, it
like,
sounds like you're saying B-R-O-A-D.
oh, no, hot rod. Kind of like a souped up car, a hot rod.
Yeah.
Now, that's probably the reference that they intended. The man who altered the song for us was concerned that there might be other connotations to the term hot rod. That's why he changed the wording when we sang it. Yeah, and maybe you can figure out the phallic reference there in the term
Did he
hot
work
rod.
at the church?
What'd you say?
I said that dirty-minded old man. What'd he do? Work for the church?
Well, he was a professor of music at the university. Yeah, he officially did work for the church. Anyway,
Yeah, and I was told about the guy who worked for the church and wouldn't allow the boys to wear ties because they pointed to the male jewels.
yeah,
Everybody had to wear a bow tie, and they had to wear suspenders because a belt cut off circulation.
yeah,
One guy took that to extreme and thought, well, God wants us to wear a belt, so, I mean, God likes suspenders, so he wore suspenders to hold up his jeans, and he wore suspenders underneath that to hold up his underwear.
yeah.
You get awfully focused on behavior and lose sight of reality.
Well, as we pointed out before, once you start governing people by written rules, no system of written rules is ever enough. You would think that once we established this nation and codified our laws, that would be enough. But no, our states and our nation all have lawmaking bodies that continually write new rules or change the old rules to adapt to our situation. And that's just a demonstration of how limited and problematic the approach of using written rules to govern life is. We need a principled approach to living. We need something that becomes part of our characters so that it takes place naturally. And the written rules can't ever do that. They can't fix what's wrong with the human race. That's why we say government can't save you. Government can't fix human brokenness. They can try, but they can't do it. And
So the question, what must I do to be saved, should be answered with nothing. Just quit worrying about it and start focusing on your Creator and getting to know Him. And let Him be the one who worries about changing you.
what was Jesus' ultimate answer to the man who asked that question, what must I do to be saved?
Um,
What lack I yet, I think was what he said.
you sell everything you've got and give to the poor.
In other words, get out of your selfish approach to life. Do something that demonstrates love. Begin to live your love. And then come, follow me, live like I live. Throw it down on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand. Perform this sign, the Lord told him, then they will believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, really has appeared to you. Then the Lord said to Moses, now put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out again, his hand was white as snow with a severe skin disease. Or that footnote is going to tell us that the Hebrew is leprosy. The Hebrew word used here can describe various skin diseases. Now, put your hand back in your cloak, the Lord said. So Moses put his hand back in, and when he took it out again, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. Now, these demonstrations were not supernatural. God doesn't operate by mysticism. They may have been superhuman. They may have been things that humans couldn't do. But they were certainly within the power of the Creator, within the bounds of His design protocols for the universe. We know God can heal disease. So for Moses to put his hand in his cloak, bring it out diseased, put it in again, bring it out, and it'd be healthy, well, that's within God's power. That's not mysticism. It might be beyond what we have the power to do, but it's not beyond God's power, and it is not supernatural. It is superhuman. The Lord said to Moses, if they do not believe you and are not convinced by the first miraculous sign, they will be convinced by the second sign. Now, I'm not positive. I don't know if Moses ended up using both signs or not. We'll check that when we get there. But it may have been because of Moses' reticence that God gave him a second sign to deliver to the Israelites because he was worried they wouldn't believe the first one. The Lord said to Moses, if they do not believe you and are not convinced by the first miraculous sign, they will be convinced by the second sign. And if they don't believe you or listen to you, even after these two signs, then take some water from the Nile River and pour it out on the dry ground. When you do, the water from the Nile will turn to blood on the ground. Moses isn't finished with his objections, however. But Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. Never have been, and I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, I get tongue-tied. My words get tangled. And I want to read that in a different version.
Let me try saying that. I got a new term to teach you. Good.
Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. That's the NIV. Here's the New American Standard Bible. You need to turn the page. Then Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. This self-assessment, I wonder about it. Would Moses have made the same self-adjustment 40 years earlier when he so brashly murdered the Egyptian? Or was this a case of he's been watching flocks for 40 years now and he's gotten a more realistic expectation of his capabilities, and now that he's confronting the angel of the Lord and is being told what God wants him to do, he's developed a strong sense of reticence, of not wanting to do this. What excuse can I give to God so I don't end up having to do what he's telling me to do here? I know, I'll tell him I'm not a good speaker. Then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord, or Yahweh? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. But Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send anyone else. Don't make me do it. I'm not ready. Well, that's why God wants you to do it. You know you're not ready. Now God can use you. Send somebody else. He got so insistent on this that it says in verse 14, then the Lord became angry with Moses. Now we're going to get a clue of what God's anger means. All right, he said. What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks well. And look, he is on his way to meet you now. He will be delighted to see you. What?
You let him have what he wanted.
Exactly. God got angry, and guess what? Moses got what he wanted, somebody else. Not all of what he wanted, but some of what he wanted. I'm sending your brother. He's on his way to meet you. How he got away from the Egyptians, I don't know, but he's on his way. He will be delighted to see you. Talk to him and put the words in his mouth. I will be with both of you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people. He will be your mouthpiece. And you will stand in the place of God for him, telling him what to say. Now, I haven't run across it here, but I think later we'll come across that Aaron was about 3 years older than Moses. And I find it interesting because the artists like to portray Moses at this point as a white-haired old man, and then they show Aaron showing up to talk to him, and Aaron is younger and dark-haired. Well, that's not very realistic. Aaron is older than Moses. Maybe they forgot and hadn't read that part. I don't know.
Well, Aaron should be the one with white hair because he's been living under the Egyptian thumb.
And he did not get liberated and live in the palace like his brother did.
So he would be getting gray hair, while Moses has been living out in the wilderness in nature with God being his companion. Where's his gray hair?
Yeah, much less stress.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the story. Mom tells her daughter, every time you act up like that, I get another gray hair. And the daughter thinks about it for a second and says, Mom, you must have been a terror when you were young. Look at Grandma.
Right.
At any rate, talk to him.
Well, that would mean Ethan was the perfect child then. I'm over 65 by some point. I don't know, and I don't have a whole lot of gray.
No, not a lot. Anyway, speaking of Aaron, God says, talk to him and put the words in his mouth. I will be with both of you as you speak, and I will instruct you both in what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people. He will be your mouthpiece. And you will stand in the place of God for him, telling him what to say. And take your shepherd's staff with you and use it to perform the miraculous signs I have shown you. So, Moses went back home to Jethro, his father-in-law. Please let me return to my relatives in Egypt, Moses said. I don't even know if they're still alive. Go in peace, Jethro replied. Before Joseph left Midian, the Lord said to him, return to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you have died.
Except there was a problem with his returning to Egypt.
What was that?
He became known as the bridegroom of blood.
Well, we're about to get to that part of it.
Well, I'm trying to not be a spoiler.
So, here is explicit evidence that at least 2 generations of Egyptian monarchs are involved. The Pharaoh who issued the death decree against Moses is not the Pharaoh that Moses is about to confront. It's explicit here. God tells Moses to return to Egypt for all those who wanted to kill you were dead. That would include Pharaoh because Pharaoh wanted to kill him. So he's dead. There's a successor on the throne. And Moses now sets out on his journey to Egypt. So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and headed back to the land of Egypt. In his hand he carried the staff of God. And in the song it's called the rod of God. With the rod of God you can set the people free. And the Lord told Moses, when you arrive back in Egypt, go to Pharaoh and perform all the miracles I have empowered you to do. But I will harden his heart, so he will refuse to let the people go. Then you will tell him, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. I commanded you, let my son go so he can worship me. But since you have refused, I will now kill your firstborn son. We'll talk more about that. Is God really in the business of killing? But this is what Moses is being instructed to say. And this is because God knows the future as well as we know the past. So God knows what's going to happen. But as we've said, it doesn't take a lot of prognosticative power to be able to say that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, would not agree to let the Hebrews leave his land. I'm going to just stop here for a moment and point something out. When the government put an end to slavery, when the president issued the Emancipation Proclamation, that was done not contrary to commerce, but actually in accord with commerce. The nation, the United States, at that time, had divided itself. And so Abraham Lincoln was not president of the southern states. He was president only of the northern states. And industries in the north, where slavery had been abolished, were concerned that southern industries and agriculture had an advantage over them because they were still using slavery. They had an economic or commercial advantage, and they wanted slavery to be ended in the southern states so that the southern agricultural and industrial interests would not have the advantage of slavery in commerce. And so what Abraham Lincoln did was, at least in part, in service to commerce of the country that he had control over. Now, you can argue about it. It's been argued, I've heard it argued, whether or not Abraham Lincoln was in the war to free the slaves. At least on the outside, the war was a war to preserve the Union, to keep all the states in one country, and to put an end to the secession of the southern states, and to bring them back into the fold, so to speak, so that all the states would again be one nation. And the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation was done in part to shore up his support in the part of the country that he had control over, where people were opposed to slavery. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he would garner that additional support to help him prosecute the war to the end that he managed to get it to, where the secession was ended, the Southern government surrendered, and the lands again came under the control of the entire nation. So, we just read here where God is telling Moses what's going to happen. At some point, there would be a loss of a firstborn son. And this firstborn bit is going to become very important in Hebrew culture, in part as a result of what we're about to read will happen. On the way to Egypt, at a place where Moses and his family had stopped for the night, I don't know if they had motels then, but the equivalent to that, a place for them to stay as they were traveling, the Lord confronted him and was about to kill him. But Moses' wife, Zipporah, took a flint knife and circumcised her son. She touched his feet with the foreskin and said, "Now you are a bridegroom of blood to me." When she said a bridegroom of blood, she was referring to the circumcision. After that, the Lord left him alone. This is a disturbing story, is it not?
Well, I see two possibilities.
All right. What two possibilities do you see?
The Lord does not kill. So, what was it that he was about to do? Was he not going to reveal the truth and natural results occur from learning the truth about yourself?
All right. What's the other possibility?
I just said both.
Oh, I thought you just said one, that he was revealing truth here.
And the other one was that was it really the Lord that appeared to him and threatened killing?
Right.
Or
In other
was it
words,
the imposter?
in the Hebrew view of things, if it happened, God did it. They did not have a theology of an enemy of God. It is hidden in the narrative of Genesis, as we read back at the beginning of the year, with the bit about the tohu vabohu description of the condition of the earth and the presence of the Spirit contending with something on the surface of the water, the planet being entirely water covered at that point. So that's a suggestion of it. But the Hebrews didn't have that. God somehow managed to get that put in the narrative for us to suss out, but it wasn't something they had. So it is possible that what's going on at this oasis or desert way station or whatever it was, where Moses and his family are spending the night, that it was an agent of the enemy of God who confronts Moses. Now, one thing that we know about this, we don't know how old these boys were, but if Moses had been in Midian for 40 years, and if he married Zipporah pretty much right away, they could have been in their upper 30s, perhaps. Can you imagine your mom performing a circumcision on you at that age? And in that case, is it any surprise that mom would then say, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me," having done this to save her husband? Now, there's a footnote there, and I've already seen it, and it's disturbing. and I'm not sure I believe it. It's not referenced anywhere else I've ever come across it. But if you go down there to footnote B, it says the Hebrew word for feet may refer here to the male sex organ. I don't know if I believe that or not, but that's what this version is
The word
saying.
what?
Huh?
The word what?
Feet. But Moses' wife Zipporah took a flint knife and circumcised her son. She touched his feet with a foreskin.
Oh.
It doesn't say, it just says his. Now you are a
Okay.
bridegroom of blood to me. Let me read that in a more literal version. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, "You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me." NIV puts it this way. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me," she said. So the Lord let him alone.
What is the meaning of the word blood? We looked that up once. It has a meaning.
Does it? Where did we look it up?
Well, I don't remember. It was in that green book,
Green Book.
that green notebook.
And where would I find that?
The case?
Well, I'm looking over there. I'm seeing blue notebooks, but not green ones.
Maybe it's blue. I thought it was green.
Are you talking about the one that you had that multiple ways of interpretation
Yeah,
document?
yeah. It was in a small 3-ring binder. I thought it was green.
Well, let me read the entry for blood in this Bible dictionary. To blood is ascribed in Scripture the mysterious sacredness which belongs to life, and God reserves it to himself when allowing man the dominion over and the use of the lower animals for food. Thus reserved, it acquires a double power, that of sacrificial atonement and that of becoming a curse when wantonly shed, unless duly expiated. Does that help at all? Does that remind you of anything?
So, you're a bridegroom of life.
Well, I'm sure that's not what she meant. It sounds to me like she was rather disgusted by
Rattled.
what her husband had caused her to have to do.
Well, let's look at the boys. You said that they were adults.
They
were
could have
being
been.
taken into a land where there was a possibility they could be taken as slaves because of their Jewish heritage.
Okay, and
They may have been fearful. They may not yet have developed the trust that they needed to go into that situation.
yeah, I'm going through a bunch of notebooks here, but I'm not finding the one you're thinking of. Is it a flexible or is it a
Three-ring binder.
huh?
A 3-ring binder.
Yeah, but what I was asking. Oh wow, look at that! There's my old 3-hole punch. Only good for a page or two at a time. put that in there backwards. There's a 3-ring binder for the church accountant. That's a computer software program. Time and space photo album. Well, maybe we'll run into it later in the week or next week sometime. But didn't find it. And verse 26 says, when she said a bridegroom of blood, she was referring to the circumcision. Now, I have wondered if perhaps what's going on here to some extent, we know that the Egyptians themselves practiced circumcision. Maybe God was expecting Moses to have his children circumcised because he was going to Egypt where that would be expected. Now, the Lord had said to Aaron, verse 27, "Go out into the wilderness to meet Moses." So Aaron went and met Moses at the mountain of God, and he embraced him. Moses then told Aaron everything the Lord had commanded him to say, and he told him about the miraculous signs the Lord had commanded him to perform. Then Moses and Aaron returned to Egypt and called the leaders of Israel together. Aaron told them everything the Lord had told Moses, and Moses performed the miraculous signs as they watched, plural, so at least 2 there, probably the rod and the leper's hand. Wasn't there a 3rd sign?
I don't remember.
Oh, the 3rd sign was to take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground, and it would become blood. So he may have performed all 3, but at least 2 of those 3. Then the people of Israel were convinced that the Lord had sent Moses and Aaron when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery. They bowed down and worshiped. And I see that we have run over by almost 10 minutes already, our usual time for this, trying to finish that 4th chapter. So next week we plan to continue with Exodus chapter 5 and to go into the story of the experience of Moses in Egypt and how he confronts the king of Egypt, or Pharaoh, and all that goes on. And we will, I expect, take some time to discuss this issue of God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And we'll look at what is said and we'll perhaps draw some conclusions about what really happened. Also, and this is a plan, not a guarantee, next week would be our normal week to do a sermon presentation. So a week from tomorrow we would have that presentation to present to you. If we get it prepared, then next week when we do the Friday night Bible study, we'll let you know that that's going to be made available, Lord willing. So until next time, we need to say goodbye, and we hope to see you again next time. And until then, goodbye and God bless.
Bye, everyone.